August 14, 1943. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty road leading to Camp Hearn, a hastily constructed prisoner-of-war facility nestled between cotton fields and cattle ranches about 100 miles northwest of Houston. Inside a canvas-covered military truck, 23 Japanese women sat in rigid silence, their faces masks of shame and uncertainty. They had been captured in the Philippines during the final chaotic days of the Japanese retreat, serving as nurses, radio operators, and administrative personnel for the Imperial Army. Now, after weeks of transport across the Pacific and then by rail across America, they were arriving at a destination none of them could have imagined. 26-year-old Yuki Tanaka pressed her face close to the small opening in the truck's canvas covering, catching glimpses of a landscape so foreign it might as well have been another planet. Endless flat plains stretched in every direction, broken only by wooden fences and the occasional windmill spinning lazily in the hot breeze. She had grown up in Kyoto, where ancient temples nestled against mountains and cherry blossoms marked the changing seasons. This place looked like the surface of the moon. Beside her, 19-year-old Michiko Sato clutched a small cloth bundle containing her few remaining possessions. She had been a communications specialist, one of the youngest in her unit, and the shame of capture weighed on her more heavily than on the older women. In Japan, she had been taught that death was preferable to the dishonor of surrender. Yet here she sat, alive and captive, waiting to face whatever horrors the Americans had planned for them. The truck lurched to a stop, and the women heard voices outside speaking in rapid English. The canvas flap pulled back, revealing blinding sunlight and the silhouettes of several men wearing what appeared to be cowboy hats. For a moment, nobody moved. The women had been told stories about American brutality, about soldiers who showed no mercy to their enemies. They braced themselves for cruelty. Instead, a weathered hand reached up, offering assistance down from the truck. The gesture was so unexpected that the first woman, a 35-year-old nurse named Keiko Yamamoto, simply stared at it in confusion. The hand remained extended, patient. Finally, Keiko accepted it, allowing herself to be helped down with a courtesy that seemed absurdly out of place given the circumstances. One by one, the women descended from the truck into a scene that defied all their expectations. The camp was smaller than they had imagined, surrounded by a simple wire fence that looked more suited to containing livestock than prisoners. The guards watching them were not hardened soldiers but older men and young boys, most wearing work clothes and expressions of profound uncertainty. It became immediately clear that these Texans had no more idea how to handle Japanese women prisoners than the prisoners knew what to expect from them. The first days at Camp Hearn passed in a fog of disorientation and careful observation. The women were housed in a long wooden barrack that had been hastily partitioned to provide some privacy, though the thin walls did little to muffle sound or provide real separation. Each woman received a narrow cot, a thin blanket, and a small wooden crate that served as both table and storage. It was Spartan, but far from the torture chambers they had been warned about. Yuki found herself drawn to the single window in their section of the barrack, spending hours watching the strange American world unfold beyond the fence. She observed the guards changing shifts, noted how they laughed and joked with each other in a casual manner that would have been unthinkable among Japanese soldiers. They moved with a loose-limbed confidence that seemed almost disrespectful, slouching against fence posts and tilting their cowboy hats back while they talked. Everything about them contradicted the rigid military bearing she had known her entire life. The other women maintained their own routines as best they could, attempting to preserve some sense of order and dignity in their captivity. Each morning, they rose at dawn and performed calisthenics in the narrow space between their cots. They kept their uniforms as clean as possible with the limited water they were given. They spoke to each other in low, formal Japanese, maintaining the hierarchies and protocols they had known in their military service. But shame hung over everything like a suffocating blanket. Michiko barely spoke those first days, her young face drawn and pale. She had written a farewell letter to her parents before her unit's final stand, never imagining she would survive to face the dishonor of capture. Now she existed in a strange limbo, neither dead with honor nor truly alive. The other women tried to comfort her, but what comfort could be offered when they all shared the same burden? Through the window, Yuki watched American life continue as if there were no war at all. She saw trucks arriving with supplies, observed guards eating lunches that looked impossibly abundant, noticed how freely they moved and spoke. Most puzzling were the civilians who occasionally appeared, ranch families bringing supplies or checking on the guards who were their sons, brothers, and husbands. Women in simple dresses and men in work boots moved through the area with an easy confidence that seemed incomprehensible to someone raised in a society of rigid rules and expectations. At night, lying on her narrow cot, Yuki listened to Michiko's quiet crying and wondered what would become of them. They were prisoners of war in a foreign land, separated from everything they had known by an ocean and by the unbridgeable gulf of shame. Whatever the Americans had planned for them, nothing could be worse than the dishonor they already carried. The guards at Camp Hearn were unlike any soldiers the Japanese women had ever encountered. Most were local ranchers and farmers, too old or too young for combat duty, who had been pressed into service watching over prisoners in their own backyard. They approached their duties with the same practical attitude they brought to mending fences or herding cattle, which meant their military protocol was inconsistent at best. The head guard was a man named Buck Morrison, a weathered rancher in his late 40s who had lost his eldest son at Guadalcanal. The women learned his name from overhearing conversations, watching as other guards deferred to him with a respect that seemed earned rather than demanded by rank. Buck wore his uniform shirt tucked into well-worn jeans, his cowboy hat more prominent than his military cap, and he moved through the camp with a quiet authority that required no shouting or threats. His nephew, a gangly 20-year-old named Tommy, had been assigned to the guard rotation despite his obvious discomfort with the entire situation. Yuki observed him through her window perch, noting how he fidgeted with his rifle and looked everywhere except directly at the prisoners during his rounds. He seemed more frightened of the women than they were of him, which struck Yuki as both absurd and oddly reassuring. The awkwardness went both ways. During the first morning roll call, Buck had stood before the assembled women with his hat in his hands, clearly struggling with how to address them. The women had bowed deeply in the Japanese manner, which seemed to fluster him further. He had nodded back, then seemed to realize that was insufficient, so he bowed as well, though his execution was clumsy and uncertain. The result was a strange dance of mutual confusion that left both parties unsure of proper protocol. Mealtimes revealed more of this cultural collision. The guards delivered food on metal trays, but they knocked before entering the barrack, as if the prisoners were guests rather than captives. The first time when this happened, Keiko had rushed to open the door and bow repeatedly, overwhelming the young guard who simply wanted to set down the food and leave. He had backed out hastily, nearly tripping over his own feet in his hurry to escape. The women discussed these peculiarities in hushed evening conversations. Why did the Americans treat them with such strange courtesy? Was it a trick, designed to lower their defenses before some brutal punishment? Or were these simple country people simply unprepared for the reality of guarding enemy soldiers, especially women? Michiko suggested it was all a cruel game, that the kindness would evaporate once the Americans tired of pretending. But Yuki wasn't so certain. She had seen something in Buck Morrison's eyes during that awkward first roll call, something that looked less like hatred and more like profound sadness. Perhaps these Texans were as lost in this situation as the prisoners themselves. The breakthrough came on a sweltering afternoon in late August, when the Texas heat had turned the camp into a shimmering oven. The women sat in whatever shade they could find, fanning themselves with folded papers and rationing the water they had been given. Yuki had positioned herself near the fence, seeking even the faintest breeze, when she noticed Tommy approaching with hesitant steps. He carried 2 glass bottles in his hands, condensation beading on their distinctive curved shapes. Yuki had seen these bottles before, glimpsed through her window observations, but had never seen one up close. The guards seemed to treasure them, drinking from them with obvious pleasure during their breaks. Tommy stopped a few feet from the fence, shifting his weight from foot to foot in that nervous way he had. He glanced back toward the guard station, then looked at Yuki with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. Without speaking, he held out one of the bottles through the fence wire. Yuki stared at it, her mind racing through possibilities. Was this a test? A trap? She had been taught never to accept anything from an enemy, that such gestures always came with strings attached. But Tommy just stood there, the bottle extended, sweat running down his sunburned face under his oversized cowboy hat. Behind her, she heard the other women gathering, their whispered conversations full of warning and concern. Keiko called out softly in Japanese, urging caution. But something in Tommy's face, that earnest awkwardness, made Yuki reach out slowly and accept the bottle. It was shockingly cold in her hands, a sensation so unexpected in the oppressive heat that she nearly dropped it. The liquid inside was dark, almost black, and through the green glass she could see bubbles rising in a constant stream. She had never seen a beverage that moved like this, that seemed alive inside its container. Tommy gestured to his own bottle, then to his mouth, demonstrating. He took a long drink, then nodded encouragingly at her. The other women had fallen silent, watching this strange transaction with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Yuki raised the bottle to her lips and took a cautious sip. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The liquid was sweet but also sharp, and it fizzed against her tongue and throat in a way that made her eyes widen in surprise. It was cold and refreshing and utterly foreign, a taste that seemed to encapsulate everything strange about America. Tommy's face broke into a wide grin at her reaction. He said something in English, speaking slowly and pointing at the bottle. Though Yuki didn't understand the words, she recognized he was telling her the name of this magical sparkling drink, Coca-Cola. He repeated it twice, carefully, as if teaching her something important. For the first time since her capture, Yuki felt something other than shame or fear. She felt curious. The Coca-Cola incident opened a door that neither side had known existed. Over the following weeks, small gestures of kindness became more frequent, each one chipping away at the wall of fear and mistrust that separated captors from captives. The women began to realize that these Texas ranchers operated by a code of hospitality that seemed to transcend even the boundaries of war. Buck Morrison set the tone with quiet consistency. He ensured the women received the same rations as the guards, refusing to short them even when supplies ran low. When he noticed that the barracks roof leaked during a rare thunderstorm, he personally supervised the repairs, treating the task with the same seriousness he would give to fixing his own home. He never raised his voice, never made threatening gestures, and always knocked before entering their quarters. Tommy continued his shy offerings, bringing small comforts when he thought no one was watching. A handful of wildflowers appeared on the barrack steps one morning, wilting in the heat but clearly picked with good intentions. When Michiko developed a persistent cough, he somehow procured honey and left it outside their door with a note that Yuki couldn't read, but understood meant kindness. The older guards, many of them fathers and grandfathers, treated the women with a careful respect that seemed rooted in their upbringing. One named Walter, who reminded Yuki of her own father with his silver hair and gentle eyes, began leaving his newspaper on a bench near the fence after he finished reading it. Though the women couldn't read English, they studied the photographs, trying to piece together what was happening in the world beyond their fence. Even the food improved as the camp cook, a portly man named Earl who had run a diner before the war, began experimenting with ways to make the meals more palatable. He couldn't replicate Japanese cuisine, but he tried to avoid the spiciest American dishes, and he always ensured there was plenty of rice. Once, he left a note asking, in badly spelled English, if the food was acceptable. Keiko, who had studied some English before the war, carefully wrote back a simple, "Thank you," which Earl pinned proudly to his kitchen wall. These small mercies accumulated like drops of water filling a vessel. The women began to sleep more soundly, their constant vigilance easing slightly. They still performed their morning exercises and maintained their military protocols, but the suffocating weight of fear began to lift incrementally. Yuki found herself watching the guards with different eyes. She observed how Tommy brought his lunch to share with the camp dog, how Buck paused during his rounds to help an elderly guard carry supplies, how Walter always had a smile for everyone, regardless of circumstance. These were not the monsters they had been warned about. They were simply men doing their duty while trying to maintain their humanity. The realization was disturbing because it complicated everything. It was easier to hate an enemy who was cruel. Kindness demanded something more difficult, recognition of shared humanity. The language barrier had seemed insurmountable until Keiko offered a tentative solution. At 42 years old, she was the eldest among the prisoners, and had worked as a teacher before being recruited into military service. One evening, she approached the fence during Buck's rounds and spoke a carefully rehearsed phrase in halting English. "We learn English? We teach Japanese?" Buck had looked surprised, then thoughtful. He removed his hat and scratched his head, a gesture the women had learned meant he was considering something carefully. After a moment, he nodded slowly and said something that ended with "tomorrow," a word Keiko recognized. The next afternoon, Buck arrived with a battered children's primer and a stubborn determination to figure out how to conduct a language lesson through a fence. The arrangement was awkward at first, with Buck pointing at pictures and saying words while the women repeated them in chorus, their Japanese accents transforming English words into something almost unrecognizable. But gradually, a system emerged. Tommy joined the lessons with enthusiasm, his youth making him less self-conscious about making mistakes. When the women taught Japanese words in return, he butchered the pronunciation so thoroughly that even Michiko cracked a smile for the first time since arriving. His earnest attempts at saying arigato came out sounding like alligator, which became an ongoing joke that transcended language barriers. Yuki discovered she had an aptitude for languages that surprised everyone, including herself. Within weeks, she could construct simple sentences, and her vocabulary expanded daily. She became the unofficial translator, bridging the gap between the guards' questions and the prisoners' responses. The role gave her purpose beyond mere survival, and she found herself looking forward to the daily lessons with an eagerness that felt almost disloyal to her former life. The lessons revealed unexpected commonalities. When Buck taught them the word family, he pulled a worn photograph from his wallet, showing a young man in uniform. His son, they understood from his pained expression. Gone, they understood from his grief. Yuki had no photograph, but she drew a simple picture of her own family in the dirt. Parents, 2 brothers, a sister. Buck nodded with understanding that needed no translation. Walter brought his grandson's schoolbooks, teaching the women to read simple stories about American children and their adventures. The women, in turn, taught the guards to count in Japanese, to recognize basic characters, and to understand simple phrases. It became a ritual that structured their days and gave everyone something to anticipate beyond the monotony of camp routine. Through language, they learned about each other's worlds. The guards discovered that these women had families who worried about them, dreams that had been interrupted by war, and fears that mirrored their own. The prisoners learned that their captors valued kindness, treasured their families, and carried their own burdens of loss and uncertainty. October brought cooler weather and devastating news from across the Pacific. The guards received newspapers filled with reports of American B-29 bombers conducting massive raids over Japanese cities. The photographs showed entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, rivers choked with debris, and civilians fleeing walls of fire. Buck, in a decision that surprised even himself, decided the women had a right to know what was happening to their homeland. He brought the newspapers to the fence where Yuki had become the designated reader. Her English was now strong enough to stumble through the articles, translating for the others in a voice that grew quieter with each terrible detail. Tokyo had been hit. Osaka, Nagoya, cities the women knew intimately, where their families lived and worked, were being systematically destroyed from the sky. The women received the news in silence, their faces carefully blank in the Japanese way of containing overwhelming emotion. But that night, the barrack filled with the sound of muffled weeping. Michiko lay curled on her cot, her small frame shaking with silent sobs as she thought of her parents in their paper house in Tokyo. Keiko sat rigidly upright, staring at nothing, her teacher's mind trying to calculate the odds of her husband and children surviving in Yokohama. Yuki found herself unable to cry. Instead, she felt a numbness spreading through her chest, a protective wall building itself around her heart. Her family was in Kyoto. Was Kyoto being bombed too? Were her parents taking shelter somewhere, or were they already gone, turned to ash in an instant of American fire? The next morning, Buck did something unprecedented. He arrived with paper and pencils, explaining through Yuki's translation that the Red Cross had established a system for prisoner correspondence. The women could write letters home, though there was no guarantee they would reach their destinations, and no promise of replies. It was a small mercy, but in that moment, it felt like everything. The women wrote frantically, pouring months of unspoken words onto paper. They wrote about being alive, about being treated well, about hoping their families were safe. They wrote things they needed to say even if the words never arrived. Michiko's letter to her parents was 3 pages long, apologizing for the shame of her capture and begging forgiveness for not choosing death instead. Buck collected the letters with gentle hands and promised to ensure they were sent through proper channels. As he turned to leave, Yuki noticed something that stopped her breath. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his jaw was clenched tight. This man who had lost his son to Japanese bullets was crying for Japanese mothers and fathers he would never meet. That evening, Tommy brought extra Coca-Colas to the fence without his usual smile. He simply set them down and walked away quickly, his shoulders hunched. The sweetness tasted different now, complicated by grief and gratitude, and a growing confusion about who exactly the enemy was supposed to be. December brought an unexpected cold snap to Texas, and with it, preparations for a holiday the Japanese women had only heard about in stories. Christmas, they learned, was the most important celebration in American culture, a time when even war was supposed to pause for reflection and family. The guards decorated the camp with strings of lights powered by a generator, and someone erected a small pine tree near the guard station, adorning it with homemade ornaments. The women watched these preparations with curiosity and confusion. Keiko explained what she knew about the Christian holiday, but her limited knowledge couldn't capture the strange magic that seemed to transform even the hardened ranchers into something softer, more hopeful. The guards sang songs during their rounds, their voices carrying across the cold night air with melodies that sounded both foreign and somehow universal in their joy. On Christmas Eve, Buck approached the fence with an announcement that Yuki translated with disbelief. The women were invited, not ordered, but invited, to join the guards for a Christmas celebration. There would be food, music, and what Buck called fellowship, a word Yuki didn't fully understand, but which seemed to mean something like shared humanity. The women debated fiercely among themselves. Was this appropriate? Was it safe? Would accepting this invitation somehow dishonor their country or their fallen comrades? Michiko argued against going, insisting it was a trap or a humiliation waiting to happen. But Keiko, with the wisdom of her years, suggested that refusing such an offer might cause more harm than accepting it. That evening, the women were escorted not as prisoners but as guests into the guard station's common room. Someone had pushed aside furniture to create space, and a long table held more food than the women had seen in months. There was roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables, and in the center of everything, an ice chest filled with bottles of Coca-Cola, their distinctive shapes promising that familiar sweet sparkle. The awkwardness lasted only moments before Tommy's mother, a sturdy woman named Martha, who had driven in from the family ranch, took charge. She guided the women to seats with a warmth that transcended language, pressing plates of food into their hands and ensuring everyone felt welcome. Her husband had died in the First World War, Buck explained quietly to Yuki, but she believed that breaking bread together was how you built peace. The guards taught the women Christmas carols, and the women taught them a Japanese folk song about winter. Walter played harmonica, while his grandson demonstrated a clumsy dance that made everyone laugh. Buck carved the roast with careful ceremony, ensuring each person received an 18-free, equal portion, treating the Japanese women with the same consideration he showed his own men. As midnight approached, Buck raised his Coca-Cola bottle and spoke words that Yuki translated haltingly but earnestly. "Tonight, we're not guards and prisoners. We're just people far from home, hoping for better days." The bottles clinked together, American and Japanese hands meeting in a toast to hope. The Christmas celebration marked a turning point in the camp's daily life. The rigid separation between guards and prisoners softened into something more fluid, more human. Buck authorized expanded activities, reasoning that idle minds led to despair for everyone involved. What emerged was an unexpected cultural exchange that enriched both groups in ways no one had anticipated. Keiko proposed teaching origami, the Japanese art of paper folding. Buck provided paper from his own limited supplies, and soon the common area became a classroom where patient Japanese hands guided clumsy American fingers through the precise folds required to create cranes, flowers, and butterflies. Tommy proved surprisingly adept, his rancher's hands accustomed to delicate work with rope and wire translating well to paper folding. He created an entire flock of paper cranes that he strung up in the guard station, declaring them good luck charms. In return, Martha Morrison began teaching the women what she called practical Texas skills. She brought fabric scraps and demonstrated quilting techniques passed down through generations of ranch women. The Japanese women, accustomed to precise needlework, took to quilting with enthusiasm. They incorporated patterns from their own tradition, creating unique designs that blended Texas stars with Japanese cherry blossoms. The resulting quilts became camp treasures, eventually gifted to guards' families who displayed them proudly despite their enemy origins. Walter discovered that Yuki had studied calligraphy before the war. He brought her ink and brushes, requesting that she teach him the graceful art of Japanese writing. His large, weathered hands struggled with the delicate strokes, but his determination was absolute. He practiced for hours, and eventually managed to write his grandson's name in Japanese characters. The boy wore the paper folded in his pocket like a talisman, showing it to anyone who would look. The women learned about ranch life through stories and demonstrations. Buck brought in rope and taught them basic knot tying, skills he said every Texan needed to know. He spoke about cattle drives, about the hard work of maintaining a ranch through drought and plenty, about the code of the West that valued a person's word above written contracts. The women listened with fascination to this world so completely different from their own, where honor was measured not in rigid adherence to hierarchy, but in honest work and kept promises. Michiko, gradually emerging from her depression, revealed a talent for drawing. She sketched portraits of the guards that captured not just their features but something essential about their characters. Buck's portrait showed his weathered strength and hidden sorrow. Tommy's captured his earnest youth and growing confidence. The guards treasured these drawings, several sending them home to families as proof that something good could emerge even from war. Through teaching and learning, the inhabitants of Camp Hearn discovered that culture was not a barrier but a bridge. Each tradition offered different wisdom, different beauty, different ways of understanding what it meant to be human. The fence remained, but it no longer seemed to separate enemies. Spring of 1944 brought an unexpected proposal that would test the boundaries of trust built over the winter months. Local ranchers, desperate for labor as more young men shipped overseas, petitioned the military to allow prisoner work programs. After considerable deliberation, Buck was authorized to establish a supervised system where prisoners could work on nearby farms during daylight hours. The announcement created anxiety among the women. Leaving the camp meant entering the wider American world, facing civilians whose sons and husbands were dying in the Pacific. Would these families, who had every reason to hate them, show the same unexpected kindness as the guards? Or would they encounter the brutality they had originally feared? Yuki volunteered for the first group, driven by both curiosity and a desperate need for purposeful activity. 6 women were selected, and on a bright April morning, they climbed into the back of Buck's truck for the short drive to the Morrison family ranch. Martha Morrison was waiting, her practical manner unchanged, treating the arrival of Japanese prisoners as casually as she might greet seasonal workers. The ranch was vast by Japanese standards, stretching across rolling hills dotted with cattle and mesquite trees. Martha put the women to work in her vegetable garden, a sprawling plot that fed both the family and provided surplus for the camp. The work was hard but satisfying, the smell of earth and growing things a powerful reminder of life continuing despite war. During the lunch break, Martha brought out sandwiches and, inevitably, ice-cold Coca-Colas from her refrigerator. The women sat in the shade of a massive oak tree, and Martha told stories about her life on the ranch. She spoke about her husband who had died in France in 1918, about raising Buck alone while managing the ranch, about the telegram that had arrived 2 years ago informing her that her grandson would never come home from Guadalcanal. Yuki translated haltingly, expecting bitterness or accusation. Instead, Martha's voice held only weary sadness. "War takes and takes," she said, looking at each woman directly. "It took my husband, my grandson, and it took you girls from your families too. We're all victims of the same terrible machine." The statement hung in the warm spring air, profound in its simplicity. These women had served the nation that killed Martha's grandson, yet she fed them from her table and paid them fair wages for their work. The contradiction should have been impossible, yet here it sat, real and undeniable as the Coca-Cola bottles sweating in their hands. Other ranches followed Martha's example. The women found themselves welcomed into kitchens, invited to share meals, treated with a courtesy that seemed distinctly Texan in its stubborn disregard for conventional boundaries. They worked hard, earning respect through competence and dedication, and slowly, impossibly, they began to feel something they had never expected to feel in enemy territory. They began to feel safe. August 6, 1945, arrived like any other sweltering Texas summer day. The women were working in Martha's garden when Buck's truck came racing up the dirt road, dust billowing behind it in an urgent cloud. His face was pale, his movements jerky as he climbed out. The words he spoke made no sense at first, even after Yuki translated them: atomic bomb, Hiroshima, entire city destroyed, casualties beyond counting. The women stood frozen among the tomato plants, dirt on their hands and incomprehension in their hearts. What was an atomic bomb? How could an entire city simply cease to exist? Buck showed them the newspaper, but the photographs were abstract, mushroom clouds and devastation on a scale that the human mind couldn't process. Tens of thousands dead in an instant, the article claimed, perhaps hundreds of thousands. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The same incomprehensible destruction, the same impossible numbers. And then, on August 15th, the announcement that shattered what remained of the world the women had known. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The camp fell into stunned silence. The guards didn't celebrate, perhaps sensing that victory built on such terrible weapons deserved no cheering. The women retreated to their barrack, where they sat in circles speaking in hushed, desperate voices. Everything they had believed, everything they had been taught about Japanese invincibility and the nobility of fighting to the death, had been revealed as lies or delusions. Michiko's reaction was the most visceral. She wept openly, her young face contorted with confusion and grief. "We were told Americans were devils," she said through her tears. "But they gave us Coca-Cola and treated us like human beings. We were told our emperor was divine, that Japan would never surrender. Now he speaks on the radio, telling us to lay down arms. What was true? What was real?" Keiko, always the teacher, tried to provide context and comfort, but her own voice wavered. She had believed she was serving a righteous cause, protecting her homeland from foreign aggression. Now she learned about atrocities committed by Japanese forces, about brutality toward prisoners and civilians that made the kindness of Buck Morrison and his men seem even more remarkable by contrast. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Yuki found herself walking to the fence at odd hours, staring across the Texas plains and trying to reconcile two contradictory truths. The country she had served had committed terrible acts in the name of empire. The enemy she had feared had shown her unexpected mercy and humanity. Both things were simultaneously true, and accepting that reality required rebuilding her entire understanding of the world. Buck found her there one evening, and they stood in companionable silence until he spoke quietly. "War makes monsters of good people, and heroes of ordinary ones. The hard part is figuring out which you were and which you want to become." Yuki nodded, understanding that the real challenge was just beginning. The weeks following Japan's surrender brought a flurry of administrative activity and agonizing uncertainty. Military officials arrived at Camp Hearn with clipboards and forms, processing the prisoners for repatriation. Ships were being organized to return Japanese prisoners of war to their homeland, and the women were informed they would be among the first groups to leave, given the special circumstances of their gender and the military's desire to avoid the complications of housing women prisoners long-term. The announcement should have brought joy, but instead it sparked a crisis of conscience that divided the women into anxious factions. Return home meant rejoining families they desperately missed, but it also meant returning to a devastated country occupied by foreign forces. The Japan they had left no longer existed. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was shattered, food was scarce, and the entire social order they had known was being dismantled by American occupation authorities. Moreover, there was the unavoidable question of shame. In Japan, prisoners of war were viewed as having failed in their duty, as having chosen dishonor over death. The women knew that returning home meant facing social ostracism, disappointed families, and a society that might never fully accept them back. Some had received letters from family members urging them to return, but others had received no word at all, leaving them to wonder if their families had disowned them entirely. Yuki found herself torn between two worlds. She thought of her parents in Kyoto, wondered if they had survived the war, imagined their joy at her return. But she also thought of the life she had glimpsed in Texas, the possibility of starting fresh without the weight of shame and expectation. Martha had quietly mentioned that the ranch could use permanent help, that there might be a place for Yuki if she wanted it. The offer was staggering in its implications. The women debated late into the night, their discussions growing heated as the departure date approached. Keiko argued passionately for return, insisting that duty to family superseded personal comfort. "Our parents raised us, sacrificed for us," she said. "How can we abandon them now when they need us most?" Several older women agreed, determined to face whatever awaited them at home with dignity. But Michiko surprised everyone by expressing doubt. "What are we returning to?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "A country that sent us to die for lies? Families who may reject us? I've learned more about honor in this Texas prison camp than I ever did serving the emperor." Buck observed these discussions from a respectful distance, but eventually he called Yuki to the fence with important news. The military was willing to consider special cases, he explained. Prisoners who could demonstrate compelling reasons to remain in America might be allowed to apply for residency. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a possibility that changed everything. The morning of September 28, 1945, arrived with a crispness that promised autumn's approach. Two military transport trucks idled outside Camp Hearn, ready to carry the Japanese women to the port in Galveston, where ships waited to take them home. Inside the barrack, the women made their final preparations, packing the few possessions they had accumulated during their captivity. Buck Morrison stood before the assembled women with a stack of papers in his weathered hands, his expression serious but gentle. Through Yuki's translation, he explained the process one final time. Each woman would be called forward to confirm her decision: repatriation to Japan, or application to remain in the United States. Those choosing to stay would face additional interviews, background checks, and an uncertain waiting period, but the possibility existed. The first 10 women chose return without hesitation. Keiko stepped forward with dignity, bowing to Buck and thanking him formally for his kindness. "My family needs me," she said simply. "My duty is clear." She embraced each of the women who had become her sisters through hellfight, shared hardship, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But when Michiko's name was called, she shocked everyone by stepping forward and speaking in careful English. "I wish to stay. Please." Her voice trembled but held firm. "In Japan, I am dishonored prisoner. Here, I can become new person. Here, I learn what honor really means." One by one, 6 more women made the same choice. A young woman named Hana, who had discovered a talent for ranching. 2 sisters who had lost their entire family in the Tokyo firebombing. A nurse who wanted to continue the medical training Martha had encouraged. Each had her own reasons, her own calculation of what future held more hope. When Yuki's name was called, she felt every eye in the room upon her. She had spent weeks agonizing over this decision, writing letters to her parents that she never sent, listing reasons to go and reasons to stay. In the end, it came down to something Buck had said weeks earlier about becoming the person you wanted to be, rather than remaining the person you had been forced to be. "I stay," she said, first in English, then in Japanese for those who needed to hear it in their native tongue. "I stay and I build new life. I stay and I honor my parents by becoming someone they can be proud of, even if they never understand." The women choosing repatriation wept as they boarded the trucks, but their tears were mixed with understanding. Those staying wept as well, mourning the separation from friends and from the country of their birth. Buck removed his hat and stood at attention as the trucks pulled away, offering a final salute to women who had been enemies and had become something far more complicated. 7 women remained standing in the Texas dust, watching their former lives disappear down the road. Tommy approached with a wooden crate full of ice-cold Coca-Colas, and together they toasted an uncertain future. The transition from prisoner of war to immigrant was far more complicated than any of the 7 women had anticipated. The military processed their applications with bureaucratic slowness, conducting interviews and background checks that seemed designed to test their patience and resolve. For 3 months they remained in a legal limbo, no longer prisoners but not yet free, living in the camp while officials in distant offices decided their fates. Buck advocated for them tirelessly, writing letters to military authorities and local officials, securing character references from every rancher who had employed them. Martha Morrison became their unofficial sponsor, offering employment contracts and housing guarantees that strengthened their applications. Tommy's mother even traveled to San Antonio to testify before an immigration board about the women's character and work ethic. Finally, in December of 1945, approval arrived. The 7 women were granted conditional residency with a path to citizenship if they maintained employment, committed no crimes, and demonstrated continued integration into American society. The conditions were strict, but they represented something unprecedented: former enemy soldiers being welcomed into American life. Yuki found work as a translator at the Regional Office of War Information, helping process documents and assist with the complex task of demobilization. Her fluency in both languages made her invaluable, and she threw herself into the work with fierce dedication. She rented a small room above a drugstore in town, decorating it with a curious blend of Japanese and Texan elements. Origami cranes hung alongside horseshoes, and her few photographs of family sat next to pictures of Martha's ranch. Michiko surprised everyone by fully embracing ranch life. She moved into the bunkhouse at the Morrison Ranch, learning to ride horses and work cattle with an enthusiasm that delighted Buck. Her small frame proved deceptively strong, and her fearlessness around the large animals earned respect from the other ranch hands. She discovered that the rigid discipline of her military training translated well to the demanding routine of ranch work. The other women scattered to various opportunities across central Texas. Hana and her sister opened a small restaurant that served a fusion of Japanese and Tex-Mex cuisine, creating dishes that reflected their own blended experience. The nurse, Ayumi, completed her American nursing certification and found work at the county hospital, where her gentle manner and tireless dedication made her beloved by patients and staff alike. Life wasn't easy. They faced prejudice and suspicion from some townspeople who couldn't separate these individual women from the nation that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Store owners sometimes refused their business, and children occasionally threw rocks or shouted slurs. But for every act of hatred, there seemed to be 2 acts of unexpected kindness: a neighbor bringing a basket of produce, an employer offering a raise, a church congregation extending an invitation to worship. The women learned to navigate this new world with the same determination that had sustained them through war and captivity. They attended English classes at night, studied for citizenship tests, and slowly, painfully, built lives that honored both where they came from and where they had chosen to go. The years transformed both the women and the world around them. By 1950, the 7 former prisoners had become integral members of their Texas communities, their presence a living testament to the possibility of reconciliation. As relations between America and Japan slowly normalized under occupation and Reconstruction, these women found themselves uniquely positioned to serve as bridges between 2 nations, learning to see each other as allies rather than enemies. Yuki's translation work evolved into something more significant. In 1952, she was recruited by the State Department to assist with cultural exchange programs designed to rebuild Japanese-American relations. She traveled to Japan for the first time since the war, witnessing firsthand the remarkable transformation of her homeland. Tokyo was rising from its ashes, democracy was taking tentative root, and the same people who had once chanted for victory or death were now embracing peace and prosperity. She reunited with her parents in Kyoto, a meeting filled with tears and complicated emotions. They had survived the war, living through hunger and loss, and they struggled to understand their daughter's choice to remain in America. But as Yuki shared stories of Buck's kindness, of Martha's generosity, of the unexpected humanity she had found in captivity, her parents began to see her decision not as betrayal, but as a different form of courage. Michiko became an unexpected ambassador for cultural understanding. She gave talks at local schools about her experience, speaking honestly about propaganda, about the lies she had believed, and about how individual kindness had opened her eyes to a different truth. Her story resonated particularly with veterans returning from Korea. many of whom struggled with their own questions about former enemies and future friends. She married one of the Morrison ranch hands in 1953, a quiet man named Jack, who treated her with steady devotion and never made her feel like anything but an equal partner. The restaurant run by Hana and her sister became a gathering place where former soldiers, both American and Japanese, found common ground over food and conversation. They hosted the first Japanese Cultural Festival in Central Texas in 1954, an event that drew thousands and helped shift local perceptions of Japanese culture from enemy to neighbor. Buck Morrison attended, wearing his best suit and carrying photographs of his son, finally able to honor his memory while embracing peace. Martha Morrison never sought recognition for her role, but local newspapers eventually told her story. The Gold Star mother who had welcomed enemy prisoners into her home and helped them build new lives. When interviewed, she shrugged off praise with characteristic practicality. "I didn't do anything special," she insisted. "I just treated people the way they deserved to be treated, as people." The women maintained contact with those who had returned to Japan, exchanging letters that tracked parallel journeys of rebuilding and transformation. Some of those who had chosen repatriation wrote with regret, struggling in a society that had indeed shunned them for their survival. Others wrote with pride about their contributions to Japan's reconstruction, about teaching their children the lessons of peace they had learned in Texas captivity. June 14, 1975. 30 years after the war's end, Buck Morrison stood on his family ranch watching a rental car navigate the long driveway. His hair had gone completely white, and arthritis slowed his movements, but his eyes remained sharp and clear. Beside him stood Tommy, now a middle-aged man with his own teenage sons, and Martha, remarkably spry at 92, leaning on a cane but refusing to sit down for such an important occasion. The car stopped, and Yuki Tanaka Henderson stepped out, followed by her husband David, an engineer she had married in 1956, and their 3 grown children. She was 58 now, her hair showing silver streaks, but her smile was immediate and genuine as she saw Buck. They embraced without hesitation, former guard and former prisoner meeting as old friends reunited. Behind Yuki's car came another, carrying Michiko Morrison and her husband Jack, along with their 2 daughters. Then another with Hana and her grown sons. 4 of the original 7 who had chosen to stay had returned to Texas for this reunion, joined by 2 who had gone back to Japan in 1945 and were visiting America for the first time since the war. The gathering represented threads of history woven together across 3 decades and 2 continents. Martha had prepared a feast that blended both traditions. Texas barbecue alongside sushi rolls, cornbread next to rice balls, and in the center of everything, a wash tub filled with ice and bottles of Coca-Cola, their familiar shapes promising that same sweet sparkle that had started everything so long ago. As the sun set over the Texas plains, the group gathered around the old oak tree where the women had once taken lunch breaks during their work release. Buck raised his Coca-Cola bottle, his hand steady despite his years. 30 years ago, he said, we didn't know if kindness could survive a war. We didn't know if people could see past their hatred to recognize shared humanity. These ladies proved it was possible. Yuki stood to respond, her English now flawless but still carrying the faint accent that marked her journey. We came here as enemies, stayed as prisoners, and left as something new. People who had learned that identity is not fixed, that home is not just geography, and that the hardest borders to cross are the ones we build in our own hearts. She held up her bottle, the carbonation still bubbling after all these years, eternal and optimistic. This Coca-Cola tasted like possibility when I was 26 and afraid. It still does. The bottles clinked together as 3 generations toasted peace, proving that even the deepest wounds of war could heal when people chose courage over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and hope over despair. The sparkling sweetness on their tongues was the same as it had been in 1943, but its meaning had transformed entirely, from curiosity to symbol, from gesture to legacy, from a simple drink to proof that even enemies could become family.